The phone rang on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing contracts. I picked it up, expecting a routine call about one of my corporate events. Instead, the wedding planner's voice came through, too polite and trembling at the edges. She said my husband had called, canceled my invitation to his brother's wedding, but insisted the $52,000 I had already paid must stay. For a moment, I could not breathe. My own husband erased me from his family's celebration and kept my money like I was just a bank account. I forced my voice into calm control. I asked her to repeat it. She hesitated, then said yes, but added softly, "You are not the bride." I let out a sharp laugh. "No," I said, "I am not the bride. I am the owner, the venue, the catering, the hotel chain where all their guests booked rooms. They are mine. My name is Elena Brooks." The silence on her end told me she finally understood. My husband had no idea. I am Elena Brooks. I am 38 years old. For 11 years, I have built the Brooks Hospitality Group, an empire of luxury hotels, resorts, and event spaces stretching from Austin, Texas to Santa Fe, New Mexico, and beyond. I started with one failing restaurant and turned it into 4 states of power. People in the industry know me as relentless and precise. But in Scott's family, I was invisible. At dinners, they called me the wife who helps with parties. They never asked how I paid for the vacations, the houses, the cars. They never wondered why Scott could play the charming husband while I worked nights and weekends. They enjoyed the lifestyle, but never respected the woman who created it. And I let them. I thought generosity meant keeping quiet. When Frank, my husband's younger brother, got engaged to Sarah, I saw the same story begin again. 3 weeks earlier at dinner, Sarah confessed they could barely pull together $12,000 for a wedding. His parents sighed. His sister started suggesting cheaper options. Scott looked at me with that familiar expectation, as if I would step in quietly, as always. Later that night, I pulled Teresa, my sister-in-law, into the kitchen. I wrote a check for $52,000. I told her to keep it secret. I wanted Frank and Sarah to have the wedding of their dreams without feeling indebted. I thought I was giving them freedom. I was really handing my husband the perfect weapon. Now, I sat in my office on the 27th floor, the Austin skyline shining in the September sun. The contracts on my desk told the story of my empire. Scott had taken my silence and turned it into my erasure. He had cut me out of the wedding, but kept my sacrifice. Then the planner spoke again, and her words landed harder than anything Scott had done. She said they had noticed something strange. Every vendor connected to Frank's wedding, the ranch in New Mexico, the catering company, the hotel with its 44 reserved rooms, all of them reported to Brooks Hospitality Group. All of them were mine. Did my husband not know that? I felt my pulse hammering as I leaned back in my chair. Scott had erased me from a celebration that was standing entirely on my shoulders. He thought silence made me weak. He had no idea that every thread of this wedding was already in my hands. And that was the moment I decided I would never stay quiet again. If you are watching this, drop a comment telling me where you are from. Hit subscribe and stay tuned to hear how I finally stood up for myself after years of being the forgotten daughter. I truly want to know how far my story will travel across the world and who out there might understand what it feels like to be erased by the very people meant to love you. I thought the first call was bad enough, but less than an hour later, my office line rang again. This time, it was Diane, another planner tied to the Henderson Walsh wedding. Her voice carried the strained politeness of someone holding back panic. "Mrs. Brooks, I'm afraid we've run into another issue. Yesterday we received instructions to remove your name from the seating chart, the invitations, even the announcements. The reasoning given was, well, that you tend to create drama. I felt my breath catch in my throat. Drama. That was the word Scott's family always used when I asked for the smallest respect. Drama when I asked to be acknowledged. Drama when I refused to bankroll their problems without a thank you. Now that word had been written into their wedding plans, used as the justification to erase me entirely. I swallowed hard, my voice even. And you followed those instructions? There was hesitation. We were told the decision came from both you and your husband. In fact, we received an email yesterday evening with your digital signature attached, confirming your consent. For a moment, I thought I had misheard. My signature? My consent? I hadn't touched any documents. I asked her to forward the email immediately. She agreed, her tone cracking as if she already suspected something was very wrong. As I waited, my mind raced back through the years. How many times had Scott's family used that word, drama, to silence me? How many times had I let it slide? I thought of Frank's anxious smile when he announced the engagement, of Sarah's tears at the dinner table, of Teresa clutching the check I gave her like it was salvation. I had believed I was protecting them. Instead, I had walked willingly into their trap. My computer pinged. The forwarded email appeared in my inbox. I opened it with shaking hands. And there it was, my name at the bottom of a PDF, my digital signature, copied and pasted, authorizing changes I never agreed to. Attached was an authorization code, a code that only I should have had access to. Someone had forged me. Someone had gone through the trouble of making me look complicit in my own erasure. Diane's voice broke the silence. Mrs. Brooks, I don't know how to proceed without your confirmation. This feels wrong. I could barely hear her. My eyes were locked on one line in the metadata of the file, a tiny note that revealed who had sent it. The email address didn't belong to Scott. It didn't belong to Frank or Sarah either. It belonged to his aunt, the same aunt who once told me, to my face, that women like me, women who built businesses, never truly belonged in families like theirs. The same aunt who smiled politely at me during dinners, then whispered my name like it was a problem to be managed. She had signed my name. She had made me vanish. I ended the call, my voice calm and clipped, promising Diane I would handle everything. But inside, something far darker was rising. My family had crossed a line I could never uncross, and as I stared at that forged code glowing on my screen, one thought echoed louder than any other. If they wanted me gone, they had just given me the perfect reason to show them what it really means to be erased. 3 weeks earlier, I had sat at the long oak table in Scott's parents' dining room, the same table where I had endured years of sideways glances and quiet dismissals. Frank announced his engagement with pride, but I could see the shadow in his eyes. Sarah leaned close to him, her fingers twisting the napkin in her lap as she whispered about student loans and a mortgage that left them with barely $12,000 to spare. His parents sighed. His sister suggested cutting the guest list, and Scott wore that familiar expression, halfway pity and halfway expectation, as if I were a faucet he could turn on whenever his family grew thirsty. I said nothing through the meal. I had learned long ago that silence was safer than volunteering truths no one wanted to hear. But later that night, when the house had gone quiet, Teresa found me in the kitchen rinsing plates. Tears streaked her cheeks. She asked if I knew any vendors who might give discounts for family. I looked at her, saw the desperation in her eyes, and without another word, I pulled out my checkbook. I wrote $52,000, slid it across the counter, and whispered, "This stays between us." Frank and Sarah deserve their day without feeling like they owe anyone. She hugged me like I had saved her life. I thought I had done something noble. In reality, I had laid the first brick of my own betrayal. After the planner's calls, I asked my IT director to pull system logs. Within hours, he appeared in my office with a printout, his brow tight. At 10:17 p.m., the night before the forged authorization arrived, someone had used a VPN tied to my husband's company laptop to access our secure network. The trail was sloppy, like a thief convinced no one would ever bother to check. I felt my throat burn, not from surprise, but from the insult. Scott had dismissed my empire as a hobby, yet here he was, using corporate tools to impersonate me. He wanted to erase me while feeding off the very machine I had built. Then came another discovery. Buried in the billing reports was an additional charge, a transfer of $8,700 routed from Margaret, my mother-in-law. It was labeled as a coordination fee. My hands trembled as I read the note. It was their way of buying the right to interfere, as if my own family's betrayal could be legitimized with a side payment. It was more than money. It was a signal that the conspiracy was wider than Scott. His mother had joined in, quietly funding the machinery of my erasure. I stared at the numbers glowing on the screen, fury rising sharp and clean. Years of swallowing small insults, of being painted as dramatic or unstable, had led here. A forged signature, stolen money, and now a financial paper trail tying his family to the scheme. My assistant slipped in quietly, placing a USB drive on my desk. Security pulled last night's camera footage from headquarters. "You'll want to see this." She left without another word. I clicked play. The grainy black and white image filled my screen. At first, just an empty lobby. Then the elevator doors opened. Scott stepped out. He swiped a keycard at the glass doors leading to my private office. My keycard. The timestamp matched the system log exactly. 10:17 p.m. I leaned forward, heart pounding. My husband had walked into my sanctuary, using my access to sign me out of my own family's life. And I realized this was no accident. It was war. The morning after discovering the forged signature, I walked into my office with a different kind of focus. My legal team was already waiting. Folders spread across the table. I slid the printout of the system log toward them. Then the contract packet with my fake authorization code. They didn't need much explanation. Within minutes, they were flipping through clauses I had insisted on years earlier. Buried deep in the fine print was the protection I had built, without realizing how vital it would become. The parent company termination clause. It allowed me, as ultimate owner, to void any agreement if terms were altered without my consent. Even better, the morals clause gave me the right to cancel contracts if unethical behavior threatened the integrity of my brand. Scott and his family had just handed me both violations on a silver platter. "Mrs. Brooks," my lead attorney said carefully, "we can shut this entire event down within 36 hours. Every vendor will be legally bound to cancel." I nodded, my hands folded neatly on the desk. I could have picked up the phone right then, called Frank, explained the truth, given him a chance to salvage his day. That was the choice any decent person might expect. But I didn't make that call. I chose silence. After years of being treated as if I did not exist, I let them taste what it meant to truly feel my absence. Some would call it cruel. Some would say I went too far. But I was done cushioning their betrayals. By noon, the first cancellations had gone out. Desert Rose Planning, Copper Mesa Catering, Desert Star Hotel. Each termination letter carried my authority. each deadline stamped in bold. 36 hours to unwind months of planning. I did not raise my voice, did not send threats. I simply pulled the levers I had built into place over a decade of acquisitions, and the machinery moved with surgical precision. The calls started within hours. Vendors startled, confused, suddenly realizing they had been answering to the wrong Morrison all along. My assistant handled most of them. But one call she put through. A small florist from Albuquerque, not technically owned by us, but tied through years of subcontracting. His voice was desperate. "Elena, I heard the bigger companies are walking away. I can cover the flowers, even help with logistics if you'll let me step in. I want to make this right." For a moment, I considered it. Then his name hit me like a strike. This was the same man who had once undercut my first catering business, leaking my client list to a competitor for a quick payout. He had smiled in my face while stabbing me in the back. Now, he wanted to play savior. "No," I said flatly. "We're not doing business again." "Not now, not ever," I ended the call without another word. That evening, after the office lights dimmed and silence settled over the 27th floor, my inbox pinged again. A new message. No name, just an anonymous address. I clicked it open. "If you want this wedding to happen, transfer 3% of the Santa Fe Resort shares to a holding company by midnight. Do that, and we'll make sure everything goes smoothly. Refuse, and your family will know exactly what you've been hiding." I leaned back in my chair, staring at the demand glowing on the screen. They had already stolen my money and my place. Now someone wanted to steal my company. And I realized the betrayal had only begun to unfold. By the next morning, the gears of my empire were already turning. One by one, vendors sent confirmation of termination. Contracts voided, deposits forfeited under the liquidated damages clause. The Santa Fe Resort canceled all 44 guest rooms. Refunds processed exactly as written in the agreements. My attorneys watched every detail, making sure the cancellations were airtight. It wasn't emotional. It was business. A clean cut, a controlled strike, the same way I had dismantled competitors who thought they could underprice me and survive. By midday, the storm broke. My phone lit up with call after call, Scott's name flashing, then his mother, then Teresa. Voicemails piled up, their voices climbing from confusion to outrage. I didn't answer. I had nothing left to say to people who thought betrayal was a family tradition. But then, late that night, my screen lit up with a name I hadn't expected. Frank. For a long moment, I stared at it, my thumb hovering. Part of me wanted to let it ring into silence, to treat him the same way he had treated me. Still, curiosity won. I pressed accept. His voice came low, shaky. "Elena, I swear to you, I didn't know. I thought you chose not to come. I thought the money. I thought it was Mom and Scott handling everything." I said nothing. The silence stretched, and in that silence, I heard his guilt, his desperation to be believed. "I have to show you something," he continued. "You deserve to know the truth." A file landed in my inbox a moment later. "Listen before you decide what to do with us." I clicked play. It was a recording, muffled at first, then clear enough to slice through me. Scott's voice. "If anyone asks, we'll say Elena's not coming because she's unstable. She works too much. She can't handle stress. She'll ruin the day." Then his mother's voice, layered on top, calm and cold. "We'll say it was for her own good, that we're protecting her. No one will question it. They all know how dramatic she gets." I froze. My own husband and his mother had branded me unstable, turning my silence into sickness, my strength into pathology. And Frank, my brother-in-law, the man whose dream I had funded, had recorded it. Elena, Frank said quietly, I can't undo what they did, but I need you to know I never agreed to this. I didn't know until tonight, and I don't want to start my marriage with a lie. For the first time in weeks, I heard sincerity from someone in that family. It shook me more than their betrayal. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe someone in that house still knew the difference between gratitude and greed. I thanked him, my voice measured, but my heart torn between anger and a flicker of relief. Then my phone buzzed again, this time with a notification from social media. A post had gone viral overnight. Elena Brooks destroyed her own brother-in-law's wedding out of jealousy. The caption read, beneath a photo of the canceled venue. She couldn't stand not being the center of attention. I stared at the screen as thousands of comments poured in, strangers deciding who I was and why I had acted. The family's whispers had escaped the dining room and turned into a public firestorm. And I knew the battle had just moved far beyond four walls. The conference room on the 27th floor had never felt heavier. Floor-to-ceiling windows glared with afternoon sun, throwing long shadows across the polished table where my in-laws sat in stiff silence. Scott's parents kept their eyes on their clasped hands. Frank shifted uncomfortably beside Sarah, and Teresa's smile looked more like a plea than a greeting. Scott sat directly across from me, his jaw tight, his eyes daring me to speak first. I placed a folder on the table, its leather cover snapping as it opened. Inside were the pieces of truth I had gathered like shards of glass. The VPN log stamped with 10:17 p.m. from Scott's laptop. The keycard record proving someone had used my access to enter my office that same night. The forged digital signature with my name attached to an authorization I never gave. And finally, the transfer of $8,700 from Margaret, labeled as a coordination fee. I slid each page across the table slowly, watching their faces pale. For years you treated me like I was invisible. You thought my silence was weakness. You thought my generosity was endless. You erased me from a celebration I paid for, and then forged my name to cover it up. Now I will set the record straight. Scott leaned forward, his voice sharp. Elena, this is a family matter. You don't need to bring in lawyers. I ignored him and turned to Frank and Sarah. Your wedding is canceled, but I am willing to let it proceed under new terms. You will pay $92,000 up front to cover every vendor. You will provide written apologies from Scott, from Margaret, from Teresa, and from yourselves. And during the reception, you will publicly acknowledge the betrayal that almost destroyed this day. The silence was suffocating. Frank's face flushed, Sarah's hands twisted in her lap. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin white line. Then, unexpectedly, Sarah spoke. Her voice was small, but it carried through the room. I need to say something. She glanced at Frank, then at Scott. I didn't know the money was stolen, but I did know about you being uninvited. Scott texted me weeks ago. He told me you wouldn't be allowed to come. He said it was already handled. Frank's head snapped toward her, shock written across his face. You never told me. Tears welled in her eyes. I thought I was protecting us. I didn't realize how deep it went. I didn't realize he was forging your name. The words landed like a crack in their perfect facade. For the first time, someone inside admitted the truth. For the first time, Scott's control slipped. I watched him, waiting for his response. His jaw worked, his hands tightening on the table edge. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, cold, deliberate. Elena, listen to me carefully. If you make this public, if you humiliate us in front of everyone, I'll make sure every file you've tried to keep buried comes out. All of it, every secret my breath caught. The room fell into stunned silence. He wasn't begging anymore. He was threatening war, and I realized the real battle was only beginning. The wedding that finally happened looked nothing like the glittering spectacle Scott's family had once imagined. It unfolded under the wide Texas sky at a quiet ranch just outside Austin. Only 28 guests sat in wooden chairs on the grass, surrounded by wildflowers that grew naturally across the fields. No chandeliers, no fountains of champagne, no $100,000 show. Just sunlight, wind, and a kind of honesty money couldn't manufacture. I stood at the edge of the gathering, watching Frank and Sarah move among their closest friends. They looked lighter, freer, stripped of the performance their families once demanded. For the first time, I could almost believe this was what they wanted all along. But I hadn't walked away from Scott yet. I had chosen separation, not divorce. I told myself it was strategy. My attorneys were still investigating the forged documents, the suspicious payments, the forged code. Ending the marriage immediately could complicate protecting the company I had spent 11 years building. Still, I knew what people would say. That I was weak, that I couldn't cut ties with a man who had humiliated me. Some would call it cowardice, others would call it caution. I called it survival. As the sun dipped low, Frank stood to speak. His voice carried across the small crowd, steady and clear. Before Sarah and I share our vows, I need to acknowledge someone who made this day possible. Elena, your generosity built the foundation of this celebration. But more than that, your strength taught us a lesson we will never forget. That love without respect is nothing. That family means accountability. He paused, his eyes shining. That's why Sarah and I are starting a scholarship in your name, the Elena Brooks Foundation for Hospitality Students. Every year, we'll fund the education of young women who want to build what you've built. The guests applauded. Sarah wiped away tears. For a moment, warmth touched a part of me I thought had turned to stone. Yet even in that moment of vindication, I felt the cold shadow of unfinished business pressing on my shoulders. After the ceremony, while guests moved toward the barn for dinner, I slipped away toward the parking lot. That's when I saw him, Scott, leaning against a black SUV, a thick folder in his hands. He looked thinner, older, but his eyes still held the same sharp calculation. "Elena," he said, his tone smooth, almost rehearsed, "I'm not here to fight. I'm here with a solution, a separation agreement. Sign this, and everything can end quietly. No scandals, no lawsuits, no public mess. Just dignity for both of us." He handed me the folder. The weight of it felt heavier than paper should. My pulse quickened as I opened it under the fading light. At first, it looked ordinary. Assets listed, properties divided, a cold partition of a life built together. But then, my eyes caught a clause buried near the back. A single page, written in vague but deliberate legal language. It required me to guarantee silence about any financial irregularities tied to Scott's business interests. I read the words twice, my chest tightening. He wasn't just protecting himself from the fallout of the wedding. He was hiding something darker. And in that instant, I realized his betrayal might be bigger than I ever imagined. 7 weeks later, I stood on the balcony of my new headquarters in Santa Fe, watching the desert horizon glow with the colors of dawn. The building was sleek, glass and steel, rising out of the earth like a promise I had finally kept to myself. For years, I had funneled everything into Brooks Hospitality, but I had always worked from Austin, always tethered to Scott and his family. Now, for the first time, I had shifted the center of my empire to a place untouched by their influence. Santa Fe was not just a new city. It was a new life. The last weeks had been a whirlwind. The exposure of the forged documents and the fraudulent authorization code had forced my attorneys into overdrive. Regulators opened an inquiry, and every stone we overturned revealed another layer of Scott's desperate maneuvers. He had been moving money between shell accounts, hiding liabilities under the company name as though no one would notice. But they did. Banks withdrew their confidence, investors pulled back, and Scott found himself drowning in debts he had once pretended didn't exist. Meanwhile, I was signing contracts with not one, but two major hotel chains. Deals that expanded Brooks' hospitality into markets I had only dreamed of. My reputation, once dismissed as Elena just helps with parties, had transformed. Industry leaders now sought me out, not just for my properties, but for my resilience, for the way I had turned betrayal into leverage. I became known as the woman who could survive fire and build something stronger from the ashes. Frank and Sarah kept their word. With the help of my legal team, they established the Elena Brooks Foundation for hospitality students. The first 3 scholarships were awarded at a university in Albuquerque, given to young women who reminded me of myself at 25. Tired, determined, underestimated. When Frank called to tell me the news, his voice carried pride. Not for the wedding he almost lost, but for the chance to give back. Sarah even joined him. Her words, quiet but sincere. They were trying to make amends, and though I had not fully forgiven them, I respected the effort. Scott, on the other hand, disappeared into the wreckage of his own choices. Rumors spread of lawsuits, unpaid debts, former business partners demanding repayment. He no longer showed up at family dinners with his easy smile. He no longer strutted through social gatherings as if my success were his birthright. The man who once thought he could erase me now lived in the shadow of the empire he had tried to exploit. And me? I chose separation, not divorce, at least for now. It was controversial. Some people said I was weak, that I should have cut him out immediately. But I knew the investigation had to run its course, and my company needed protection first. Waiting wasn't weakness. It was strategy. Still, I carried the sting of those whispers, the judgment of strangers who saw only hesitation, where I saw control. One evening, as I locked up my new office, I caught myself staring at the reflection in the glass. For years I had been silent, letting others define me as dramatic, unstable, invisible. Now I saw a woman who had chosen her own voice, her own boundaries, her own path. The scars of betrayal were still there, but they no longer dictated my worth. Frank's scholarship fund reminded me that even broken relationships could give birth to something better. His growth proved that betrayal doesn't have to be the end. It can be the beginning of accountability. And as for Scott, his downfall was not mine to orchestrate anymore. The truth had done that work for me. I learned something I wish I had known years ago. Love and kindness mean nothing without boundaries. Generosity is not weakness, but it becomes dangerous when you allow others to use it as a weapon against you. Forgiveness is powerful, but forgiveness without accountability is just surrender. Real courage is not only in giving, but in knowing when to walk away, when to protect what you have built, when to demand respect. I can forgive, but I will not forget. Forgiveness for me does not erase the betrayal. It simply frees me from carrying its weight. I will not waste my future in chains forged by someone else's resentment. I choose to let go, not for them, but for me, and for the life that still waits ahead. When trust is broken by those closest to us, Would you choose to walk away, or would you demand accountability before forgiveness?